Chicago, 1925. The city pulsed with the rhythm of jazz and the clandestine flow of illegal liquor. Vincent "Vinny" Torrino ruled the South Side with an iron fist, his bootlegging empire stretching from the docks to the speakeasies that dotted the shadowy streets. At 38, he had built his reputation on violence and cunning, commanding respect from both allies and enemies alike. His mansion on Prairie Avenue stood as a testament to his success, with its grand staircase and crystal chandeliers imported from Europe. Yet within those opulent walls lived a woman who had become as invisible as the servants who cleaned the marble floors. Elena Torrino, once the most beautiful girl in Little Italy, now spent her days staring out frost-covered windows, watching the world move without her. Vinny had married Elena 7 years ago, drawn to her dark eyes and gentle smile. She had been the daughter of a respected baker, and their union had sealed important alliances in the neighborhood. In those early days, he would bring her flowers from the market and take her dancing at the legitimate clubs downtown. But as his empire grew, so did his distance from the woman who bore his name. The business consumed him entirely. Meetings with suppliers from Canada stretched late into the night. Disputes with rival gangs required his constant attention. Police officials needed careful handling and generous payments. Federal agents lurked around every corner, making every shipment a calculated risk. Vinny told himself that everything he did was for Elena, to give her the life of luxury she deserved. Yet he failed to see that luxury meant nothing without love. Elena's days followed a predictable pattern. She would wake alone in their vast bedroom, the silk sheets cold beside her. Breakfast arrived on a silver tray served by Maria, the elderly Italian woman who had become her only companion. The afternoons stretched endlessly as she read books or attempted needlework, skills her mother had taught her in simpler times. Dinner was often solitary, as Vinny conducted business in his study or disappeared entirely to handle matters across the city. The neighborhood wives whispered about her isolation. Some pitied the boss's wife trapped in her golden cage. Others envied her wealth while remaining ignorant of her loneliness. Elena had tried reaching out to them initially, hosting tea parties and charity events, but the fear surrounding her husband's reputation kept most at a distance, and genuine friendships proved impossible to cultivate. When Vinny did appear at home, he was distracted and short-tempered. Phone calls interrupted their rare conversations. Associates arrived at all hours, turning their dining room into an impromptu meeting space. Elena learned to make herself scarce during these gatherings, understanding that her presence was neither wanted nor appropriate for discussions of territorial boundaries and profit margins. She began to question the man she had married. The gentle boy from the neighborhood who had courted her with poetry and promises had transformed into someone she barely recognized. His hands, once soft against her cheek, now bore scars from violence she preferred not to imagine. His eyes, which had once looked at her with adoration, now seemed to look through her as if she were merely another piece of furniture in his carefully constructed world. The isolation took its toll on Elena's spirit. She lost weight, her cheekbones becoming more pronounced in the mirror each morning. The vibrant woman who had once laughed easily and danced until dawn became a shadow of herself. Even Maria noticed the change, occasionally bringing extra portions of minestrone soup and gentle words of encouragement in their shared Italian dialect. As winter settled over Chicago in early 1925, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She would no longer wait for her husband to remember she existed. She would no longer accept being relegated to the margins of her own life. Though she did not yet know how, she was determined to reclaim some measure of happiness, even if it meant defying the man who controlled everything else in her world. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of Vincent Torrino's carefully constructed empire, triggered by a simple gesture that would expose the depth of his neglect and the dangerous consequences of taking love for granted. Across town in the warehouse district, Anthony Tony Marcelli sat behind his mahogany desk, studying reports from his lieutenants. The Irish gangs on the north side were getting bolder, cutting into territories that had been neutral for months. His own operation, while smaller than Torrino's empire, was growing steadily through careful planning and strategic alliances. At 35, Tony possessed the patience that Vinny seemed to have lost in his rise to power. Tony had known Elena before her marriage to Torrino. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same church, and shared conversations after Sunday Mass. He remembered her laugh, the way she would blush when he complimented her cooking, and how her eyes lit up when she spoke about her dreams of traveling beyond Chicago's borders. When she married Vinny, Tony had accepted defeat gracefully, focusing his energies on building his own criminal enterprise. But Tony kept tabs on everyone in his world, including the wives of his rivals. Through carefully placed informants and casual neighborhood gossip, he learned of Elena's increasing isolation. Maria, who shopped at the same market where Tony's mother still bought vegetables, occasionally shared worried observations about Mrs. Torrino's obvious unhappiness. The information sparked an idea that combined business strategy with personal satisfaction. Tony understood that the most effective attacks against powerful men often came through unexpected vulnerabilities. Torrino's businesses were well protected, his crew loyal, and his reputation for violence kept most challenges at bay. But his treatment of Elena represented a weakness that could be exploited without firing a single shot or losing a single man. Sometimes the most devastating wounds were inflicted on a man's pride rather than his body. The plan required delicate timing and perfect execution. Tony spent weeks observing the Torrino mansion, noting patterns in Elena's routine. She walked to church every Tuesday morning, always alone except for one bodyguard who maintained a respectful distance. She visited the library on Thursday afternoons, choosing books that suggested an intelligent woman starved for intellectual stimulation. These small rebellions against her confined existence told Tony everything he needed to know about her state of mind. On a cold February morning, Tony made his move. He stationed himself outside the church as Elena emerged from morning mass, her black coat buttoned against the wind. She moved with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to carry herself properly in public, despite her private struggles. When their eyes met across the street, Tony touched his hat brim in a respectful greeting. Elena's slight nod in return confirmed that she remembered him from their shared past. The following Tuesday, Tony appeared again, this time with a small bouquet of white roses wrapped in simple paper. He approached her bodyguard first, introducing himself as an old family friend who wished to pay his respects to Mrs. Torrino. The guard, recognizing Tony's reputation but seeing no immediate threat in the gesture, allowed the brief interaction. Tony presented the flowers with old-world courtesy, explaining that his mother had asked him to convey her regards to Elena's family. Elena accepted the flowers with surprise and genuine gratitude. For the first time in months, someone had thought of her as more than an extension of her husband's property. The roses were beautiful, their petals perfect despite the harsh winter weather. She thanked Tony quietly, their conversation lasting only moments, but carrying the weight of shared memories and unspoken understanding. Word of the encounter reached Vinny within hours. His network of informants and loyal soldiers ensured that nothing significant happened in his territory without his knowledge. When Joey Castellano, one of his most trusted lieutenants, reported the incident that evening, Vinny initially dismissed it as meaningless. Tony Marcelli was a competitor, but hardly a serious threat. The flower delivery seemed like nothing more than a calculated show of respect between neighborhood families. But as the days passed, the gesture gnawed at Vinny's consciousness. He found himself remembering details about Tony that he had previously ignored. The man was younger, unmarried, and known for his old-fashioned manners with women. More importantly, Tony had grown up in the same circles as Elena, sharing cultural references and childhood memories that Vinny had never bothered to explore with his own wife. The roses sat in a crystal vase on Elena's dressing table, their fragrance filling the bedroom each morning. When Vinny finally noticed them, he asked about their origin with forced casualness. Elena's explanation was truthful but incomplete, mentioning Tony's mother, while omitting her own emotional response to the unexpected kindness, something in her tone, a warmth that had been absent from their conversations for years, set off alarm bells in Vinny's mind. For the first time in months, Vincent Torrino found himself truly looking at his wife, seeing the changes that his neglect had wrought and recognizing the dangerous territory he had inadvertently created through his indifference. The following weeks brought an uncomfortable tension to the Torrino household. Vinny found himself paying attention to details he had ignored for years. He noticed how Elena's face brightened when she arranged fresh flowers, how she hummed softly while reading by the window, and how she seemed to carry herself with renewed purpose. These small changes, which should have pleased him, instead filled him with growing unease. Elena, for her part, was experiencing an awakening she had not expected. Tony's simple gesture had reminded her that she was still a woman worthy of consideration and respect. The white roses had wilted and been replaced, but their impact remained fresh in her memory. She began to take more care with her appearance, not for Vinny's benefit, but for her own sense of dignity. She selected her dresses more thoughtfully, spent extra time arranging her dark hair, and even applied a touch of rouge to her pale cheeks. Maria noticed the transformation immediately. The elderly housekeeper had watched Elena fade over the years, her spirit dimming like a lamp running low on oil. Now there was a spark in her eyes that had been missing for too long. When Maria complimented her appearance one morning, Elena smiled genuinely for the first time in months, explaining that she had simply decided to stop neglecting herself. Vinny's business associates began to comment on his distraction during meetings. Mickey Torelli, his longtime partner in the liquor trade, observed that the boss seemed preoccupied with matters beyond their usual concerns. During a crucial negotiation with suppliers from Detroit, Vinny's mind wandered repeatedly to the image of his wife accepting flowers from another man. The deal, which should have been routine, required multiple sessions to complete because of his lack of focus. The situation escalated when Joey Castellano brought disturbing news from his network of street informants. Tony Marcelli had been asking questions about Elena's daily routines, showing interest that went beyond casual neighborhood curiosity. More troubling still, some of Tony's associates had been spotted near the church and library during her regular visits. What had initially seemed like an innocent gesture was beginning to look like the opening move in a more complex strategy. Vinny's response was swift and predictable. He doubled Elena's security detail, assigning a second bodyguard to accompany her on all outings. When she protested the additional restrictions, he explained them as necessary precautions against federal agents who might target the families of prominent businessmen. Elena accepted the explanation, but Vinny could see in her eyes that she understood the real reason for his sudden concern. The increased surveillance had an unintended consequence. Elena's movements became more limited, but her resentment grew proportionally. She found herself comparing Vinny's controlling response to Tony's respectful gesture. And the contrast highlighted everything that was wrong with her marriage. Her husband saw her as property to be protected rather than a person to be cherished. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. Meanwhile, Tony Marcelli was carefully observing the effects of his initial gambit. His sources reported Vinny's increased attention to Elena's activities, confirming that the strategy was working exactly as planned. Tony understood that powerful men like Torrino were often most vulnerable when their pride was threatened. By treating Elena with the courtesy her own husband denied her, Tony was exposing Vinny's failures as both a leader and a man. The psychological warfare escalated subtly. Tony ensured that Elena would see him during her restricted outings, always maintaining a respectful distance, but making his presence known. He never approached her directly again, understanding that Vinny's heightened vigilance made such contact impossible. Instead, he relied on meaningful glances and the kind of old-world courtesies that reminded Elena of what she was missing in her own home. Elena found herself looking forward to these brief encounters despite herself. Tony represented a connection to the person she had been before marriage transformed her into Mrs. Vincent Torrino. When she saw him at the market or near the church, she felt a flutter of recognition that had nothing to do with romantic attraction and everything to do with being seen as an individual rather than an extension of someone else's reputation. The tension reached a breaking point one evening in late February. Vinny arrived home earlier than usual to find Elena in the parlor, reading a book of Italian poetry that had belonged to her father. The sight of her absorbed in literature, looking beautiful and serene in the lamplight, should have filled him with pride. Instead, he felt a stab of jealousy and possessiveness that surprised him with its intensity. For the first time in years, Vinny sat down beside his wife and attempted genuine conversation, but the effort felt forced and awkward after so much neglect. Elena responded politely, but without the warmth he suddenly realized he wanted desperately to reclaim. The distance between them had grown too wide to bridge with a single evening's attention, and both of them understood that fundamental changes would be necessary to repair what had been broken. March arrived with unexpected warmth, melting the snow that had blanketed Chicago for months. Elena ventured out for her Thursday library visit, accompanied by her usual bodyguards who maintained their watchful distance. She had grown accustomed to their presence, treating them as part of the landscape rather than intrusions on her privacy. What she did not expect was the elaborate display waiting for her on the library steps. A delivery boy from Romano's flower shop stood beside an enormous arrangement of red roses, easily 36 blooms arranged in an ornate crystal vase. The accompanying card, written in Tony Marcelli's distinctive handwriting, bore a simple message. For the most beautiful woman in Little Italy. With respect and admiration from an old friend. The gesture was bold, public, and impossible to ignore. Elena's bodyguards immediately recognized the implications. This was no longer a subtle game of psychological warfare, but an open challenge to their boss's authority. While one guard escorted Elena inside the library, the other used a nearby telephone to contact Joey Castellano directly. Within minutes, word of Tony's escalation was racing through the network of informants and associates that kept Vinny informed of developments in his territory. Elena herself was torn between gratitude and fear. The roses were magnificent, their crimson petals perfect, and their fragrance intoxicating. No one had ever given her such an extravagant gift, not even her own husband during their courtship. But she understood the danger inherent in accepting such a public display of attention. Her hands trembled slightly as she instructed the delivery boy to return the flowers, explaining that there had been some mistake. The boy, however, had been well paid and thoroughly instructed. Tony Marcelli had anticipated Elena's reluctance and had told the delivery service that the flowers were not to be returned under any circumstances. If Mrs. Torrino could not accept them personally, they should be left at the library as a donation to brighten the reading room. Either way, the message would be delivered, and the challenge would be clear. Word reached Vinny while he was conducting a meeting with his chief lieutenants at a warehouse. On the south side, Mickey Torelli was in the middle of explaining shipping schedules when Joey Castellano burst through the door, his face flushed with urgency. The room fell silent as Joey delivered his report, describing the flower delivery in detail and emphasizing the public nature of Tony's gesture. The effect on Vinny was immediate and explosive. Years of suppressed guilt over his treatment of Elena, combined with his natural territorial instincts and wounded pride, erupted in a display of rage that shocked even his most hardened associates. He swept papers and glasses from the table, his face turning purple with fury as he processed the implications of what Tony had done. "That son of a bitch thinks he can embarrass me in my own neighborhood," Vinny roared, his voice echoing off the warehouse walls. "He thinks he can make a play for my wife and I'll just stand there like some weak-kneed fool." The other men in the room exchanged nervous glances, recognizing the dangerous mood that had overtaken their boss. Mickey Torelli attempted to calm the situation, pointing out that Elena had refused the flowers and that no real harm had been done. But Vinny was beyond rational discussion. In his mind, Tony's gesture was not just an insult to his marriage, but a direct challenge to his reputation and authority. If word spread that another man could court Vinny Torrino's wife without consequences, his enemies would see it as a sign of weakness. The meeting transformed from a business discussion into a war council. Vinny began planning his response with the same methodical approach he used for eliminating business rivals. He wanted Tony Marcelli to understand that there were consequences for overstepping boundaries, particularly when those boundaries involved Vincent Torrino's family. The response would be swift, decisive, and designed to send a clear message to anyone else who might consider similar provocations. Elena returned home to find the mansion in unusual turmoil. Servants whispered in corners, bodyguards spoke in urgent tones on telephones, and Maria crossed herself repeatedly while preparing dinner. When Elena asked about the commotion, she was told that Mr. Torrino was handling important business matters and should not be disturbed. But the tension in the household was unmistakable, and Elena suspected that her refusal of Tony's flowers had not been enough to prevent a crisis. Late that evening, Vinny finally arrived home, his fury barely contained beneath a veneer of cold control. He found Elena in their bedroom, brushing her hair before the mirror, as she had done countless nights before. But this time, he truly looked at her, seeing not just his wife, but the woman another man desired enough to risk everything to court. "We need to talk," Vinny said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Elena set down her hairbrush and turned to face him, recognizing in his expression the storm that was about to break over all of their lives. The neglect that had defined their marriage was about to be replaced by an attention that might prove even more dangerous than the indifference that had preceded it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the bonds of marriage, but the delicate balance of power that kept Chicago's underworld from descending into open warfare. The conversation that followed would reshape the Torrino marriage forever. Vinny paced their bedroom like a caged animal, his anger alternating between fury at Tony's audacity and desperate recognition of his own failures. Elena sat quietly on the edge of their bed, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the storm to pass so they could finally speak honestly about the wreckage of their relationship. 7 years, Vinny began, his voice raw with emotion. 7 years I've worked to build something for us, to give you everything you could want. And this is how you repay me, by encouraging some two-bit rival to think he can steal what's mine. Elena's eyes flashed with the first real anger she had shown in years. I am not something you own, Vincent. I am not a piece of territory to be defended, or a business asset to be protected. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Vinny stopped pacing, struck by the quiet dignity in her voice and the truth she had spoken. For the first time, he began to understand that his neglect had created the very vulnerability Tony had exploited. Elena continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. When was the last time you brought me flowers? When did you last ask about my thoughts, my dreams, my fears? Tony Marcelli showed me more consideration in 5 minutes than you have in 5 years. Vinny's immediate impulse was to assert his authority, to remind Elena of her place and obligations as his wife. But something in her bearing stopped him. This was not the submissive woman who had accepted years of indifference. This was the spirited girl he had fallen in love with, awakened at last by another man's attention. The realization was both humiliating and oddly thrilling. Meanwhile, across the city, Tony Marcelli was preparing for the consequences of his bold gambit. He understood that Vinny's response would be violent and swift. His own men were on high alert, his businesses secured, and his family moved to safe locations outside the city. Tony had no illusions about the danger he had courted, but he also understood that sometimes the greatest victories required the greatest risks. The war that erupted between the Torrino and Marcelli organizations was brief but decisive. Vinny's superior numbers and resources gave him significant advantages, but Tony's careful planning and intimate knowledge of his opponent's weaknesses allowed him to strike at crucial vulnerabilities. Federal agents, already investigating both organizations, used the conflict as an opportunity to gather evidence and make arrests. Within 2 weeks, both Tony and Vinny found themselves facing federal charges for violations of the Volstead Act. The Flower War, as the newspapers dubbed it, had exposed both operations to scrutiny that neither could withstand. Tony accepted a plea bargain that would send him to federal prison for 5 years. Vinny, with better lawyers and more political connections, received a shorter sentence but faced the complete dismantling of his criminal empire. The night before Vinny's surrender to federal authorities, he and Elena had their most honest conversation since their wedding day. Sitting in their garden beneath the spring stars, they spoke about missed opportunities, unspoken needs, and the price of taking love for granted. Vinny admitted that his pursuit of power had cost him the only thing that truly mattered. Elena acknowledged that her own passivity had contributed to their estrangement. When I get out, Vinny said, taking her hand for the first time in months, things will be different. I'll be different. Elena squeezed his fingers gently, surprised to find that she still felt love for the man beneath the hardened criminal exterior. We'll both be different, she replied. We'll have to be. Elena used Vinny's imprisonment to rediscover herself. She sold the mansion and most of their possessions, using the proceeds to open a small bakery in their old neighborhood. The work was hard but honest, connecting her to the community in ways that wealth and isolation had made impossible. She visited Vinny regularly, and their conversations gradually rebuilt the foundation of trust and affection that had been buried under years of neglect. Tony Marcelli emerged from prison to find that his gambit had cost him everything but had also freed him from the burden of criminal life. He moved to California, where he opened a legitimate business and eventually married a schoolteacher who appreciated his old-world courtesies. He never contacted Elena again, understanding that his role in their story had ended with the delivery of those fateful flowers. When Vinny was released after serving 18 months, he returned not to a criminal empire, but to a woman who had learned to value herself and a marriage that had been tested by fire and survived. They worked side by side in the bakery, rebuilding their relationship one conversation at a time. The man who had once commanded fear throughout Chicago learned that the greatest victory was earning his wife's respect and love. The white roses that had started their journey toward redemption were replaced by the simple flowers Elena grew in the window box above their bakery. Each morning, as they prepared bread for their neighbors, Vinny would pick a single bloom and present it to his wife with the courtesy she deserved. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything they had lost and found again, through the painful lesson that love, like trust, must be tended daily or it will wither and die. Their story became a cautionary tale whispered in the speakeasies and social clubs of Chicago, a reminder that even the most powerful men could be brought low by neglecting the people they claimed to love most.